Good morning, class. We're going to talk today about something called fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is one of the main tools that a government has at its disposal to try to address economic problems, macroeconomic problems. So, for example, if the government finds that inflation is occurring and they want to do something to stop it, one possible remedy would occur through fiscal policy channels. Or alternatively, if the government found that unemployment was too high and they wanted to do something about that, create more jobs, they could go with a fiscal policy response. All right. Fiscal policy most basically references changes that you're going to see in either taxes or government spending. And this can be either expansionary or contractionary. So a moment ago I was talking about a potential problem associated with unemployment. Right? So another way to say that is that the economy is not producing enough goods and services. Right? So the government then can try to stimulate additional spending, increase aggregate demand by changing either one of those two variables. Either a tax cut would get people to start spending more money and as a consequence increase aggregate demand, or alternatively they could increase government spending and that would do the trick as well. In contrast, if you're trying to fight inflation, a government would engage in contractionary fiscal policy. And that would mean either increasing people's taxes to get them to stop spending so much or decreasing government spending. Right? So the real idea here is that either you're going to change taxes or government spending, and by doing so, it's either going to increase or decrease aggregate demand in the economy. Right? So as I've described it then, that's fiscal policy sort of in a best case scenario, assuming that everything works just as we want it to. Of course, in practice, implementing fiscal policy is a little bit more difficult. And so I want to talk now about a couple potential difficulties that you might see associated with fiscal policy. One problem you need to look out for is the existence of something called lags. And these lags just have to do with getting the timing right on using fiscal policy. There are three particular lags that you guys ought to know about. The first is something called the recognition lag. And this is getting at this idea that it takes policymakers some time to properly diagnose a problem. Policymakers, governments don't know instantaneously that inflation is occurring or unemployment is rising or something like that. Right? They don't have access to data always that gives them an idea, a snapshot of the economy perfectly. It takes some time for folks to recognize that a problem is occurring. This is the so-called recognition lag. Right? So that's one problem with fiscal policy, is that by the time policymakers figure out that inflation is occurring or unemployment is rising or something like this, then it's possible that conditions would change. Right? So the timing is difficult in that sense. Another lag that you guys want to know about is something called the administrative lag. And this is referencing the time that it takes policymakers to decide what to do. Right? So after they've experienced this recognition lag, say, and figured out, okay, inflation is occurring, we need to do something about that, it takes government and policymakers some time to decide exactly what to do. That's referencing the administrative lag, that time that it takes for policymakers to choose the proper course of action. And then the third lag that you should know about is something called the operational lag. And with the operational lag, this is referencing the time that it takes for a given policy to have its desired effect. Right? So it could be the case that we cut taxes, trying to get people to start spending more money, but the intended change in aggregate demand is not going to occur instantaneously. Right? If you get a tax cut today, you might not start spending additional money today. It might take some time before you're feeling comfortable enough to start buying more goods and services. That'd be an example of the operational lag. And so the takeaway here on these lags is that the three of these things together, the recognition lag, administrative lag, and operational lag, make it difficult for policymakers to effectively use fiscal policy. All right, so that's one problem that you might see with fiscal policy. A second is the existence of something called crowding out. Crowding out occurs with expansionary fiscal policy, where we're trying to get more spending to occur. And the the issue here is that a given policy might increase spending in one area of the economy while simultaneously decreasing spending somewhere else. A lot of times crowding out occurs because of increases that you see in interest rates. So let's go through an example. Let's suppose the government's trying to increase aggregate demand and they introduce a tax cut as a means to accomplish this, right? To continue paying for all the stuff that government needs to pay for, they might borrow additional sums of money, right? That's a likely course of action. As the government is borrowing additional sums of money, that puts upward pressure on interest rates. And we know by now that there's all sorts of different types of spending in the economy that are sensitive to interest rates. So it might be the case that that tax cut has the desired effect of increasing consumption spending in some areas, but it's also pushing up interest rates and could potentially decrease consumption spending in another area of the economy or decrease investment spending in another area of the economy, right? So this is the problem with crowding out, right? Increases that use expansionary fiscal policy can increase spending on the one hand, but ends up reducing private spending somewhere else in the economy, right? And so that's another argument that some folks will cite when they're arguing against the use of fiscal policy. It's not for me to tell you whether or not these are legitimate concerns or not. You see, in fact, that reasonable folks, smart economists disagree on this stuff. And so this was sort of brought out a little bit in the film Commanding Heights, right? You've got some folks that argue that the best course of action for a given government when we're entering into a recession is to engage in this sort of expansionary fiscal policy, right? That's a defensible argument. There's other folks, though, that argue that the existence of these lags or the potential for crowding out makes the use of fiscal policy too difficult, and we're going to end up doing more harm than good in the event that we're trying to manipulate and change aggregate demand. And so this is one of the things that's really interesting about studying public policy is that we see some disagreement about this. It's not a decided issue with respect to whether or not this can be effective always. Okay. Bye-bye.